Good evening to everybody. Welcome to the 2025 legislative session recap from the Connecticut Mirror with State Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Pazniokas and State Policy Editor Erica Phillips. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get started, I want to thank the generous financial supporters of Connecticut Mirror's event series, our presenting sponsor, Eversource, the amplifying sponsors, CBIA and the Mohegan Tribe, publishing sponsors, CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law LLC, and the Causeway Agency. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without the direct financial support of the many, many readers of the Connecticut Mirror. You can go to ctmirror.org and click that donate button if you haven't yet made a yearly contribution to support this independent journalism. You, of course, have a chance to ask questions of our panelists about the state session. It's at the bottom of the screen. You know how to use Zoom after all these years since COVID, right? At the bottom, there's a Q&A function. We can't get to all of the questions that you put in there, of course, and sometimes we get several questions on the same topic, so I'll try to condense them at times, but we'll try to, as I say, get to as many as possible. And so, without further ado, I want to welcome you in. Erica, Mark, good to see you both. Thanks for doing this.
To see you
Good
too.
evening.
So let's get started here. And here's how I always like to start. I've been doing this sort of thing with Paz for a very, very long time. I think it's important to just sort of get a takeaway from this because you both covered this so closely over the course of the last couple months. I'll ask you first, Erica, what was the big story for you? When someone says, what happened during this legislative session? Like, what's the thing that comes to mind that says, this is the story that kind of holds this whole thing together?
Well, I think every conversation that was had during this legislative session, every debate, every individual offering testimony came in the context of a lot of uncertainty at the federal level. So anything and everything that gets decided by the legislature during this session could change. I guess I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of these decisions are being made in the context of not knowing what Congress is going to do, and there is a likelihood that the legislature will have to come back into special session depending on what the outcomes are in Washington. So it was a legislative session with a lot of uncertainty, even after the final decisions had been made.
And it seems, Paz, and before I get to your big overarching answer, I mean, this is something that has happened before. It's not as though Connecticut is immune from what is happening in Washington, but it seems particularly acute this year that almost every decision, every idea that comes through the legislative process in Hartford probably has, there's some bearing on Washington, right? Somebody is looking at this going, I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the federal budget, and so I don't know if this idea that I have is even going to work.
Well,
Right.
you take,
Oh, go ahead, Pat. Go ahead,
no, I
Mark.
was going to say you take the uncertainty that's normal and then it's exponentially more complicated. That's not a terribly brilliant insight on my part. Anybody who is tuned into this is well aware of what's going on in Washington. But I mean, it really has been hanging over the General Assembly the entire session. And people realized there wasn't not going to be any resolution before the General Assembly finished its work on June 4th.
Erica, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Basically what he said.
Okay, excellent. So Paz, how about you? I mean, what's the big idea that you were looking at during this session? What's the thing that sort of is the big takeaway for you?
Big takeaway for me is I hated this session. This session was dominated by taking apart or keeping together how the fiscal guardrails were going to work. Somewhere in Connecticut, Keith Faniff is holding his head right now because I have just said I hate his part of what we do. What he does is so important. But, so it just seemed to me that so much of the session revolved around the mechanics of the volatility cap, the spending cap, the revenue cap. What would the governor give ground on? What would it mean? Would we be embarking on a slippery slope that was going to destroy the guardrails that have resulted in Connecticut really making inroads on what my colleague Keith Faniff reminds us is really 70 years of neglect and malfeasance. So, I am at heart, I'm a political reporter. I love public policy stuff, but I like the arguments over what a public policy is going to do. And, you take them really the biggest bill that came out of the legislative session, which is creating a trust fund for early childhood education and care. And this is really a bold, bold act. Looking around the country, it does not appear anybody who has done anything this sweeping to address what it was a term I heard last week for the first time, and I've since read about it, called the trilemma, and what that is a reference to that when it comes to daycare is now passe. It's all early childhood because the idea is there's an educational component in pre-K, but it's the idea that if you improve quality, you're gonna hurt accessibility, because if you increase the pay of these people who do this very important work, you're going to make this stuff more expensive, and therefore it makes it less accessible. And so this trust fund really is a creative and bold approach to that. And it's going to be, in simple terms, it's going to be a significant subsidy for the early childhood programs that participate in this. You're going to have to agree eventually. It's going to take some time to really ramp up, but you're going to have to agree to pay your people, the ones who have a bachelor's degree, similar to a public school teacher would get. So and it's going to be free eventually for families who make $100,000 or less, and it's going to be a significant discount for people up to $200,000. So this could be a real game changer for what it's like to raise children in the state of Connecticut. But so much of the debate wasn't about the specifics of the policy. It was about, is creating this off-budget trust fund a gimmick? Is this blowing up or eviscerating the guardrails, as Vinnie Candelora, the House Republican leader, argued?
I want to get more to that. Go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple things. I'm an editor at the Mirror, but for the last few years, I was covering economic development, and one of the largest stories that I was following during that time was the childcare question in Connecticut, because it has such a major impact on whether adults can work or not, and that has a huge impact on the economy. So two details. One is that New Mexico has a similar thing. So Connecticut was the trust fund idea was developed with some kind of knowledge of what New Mexico has done, and there are a lot of differences, of course. And the other piece is that the trust fund was actually created last year by the legislature, but had no money in it. So at the time when I was writing about that, I thought, great, guys, you made a trust fund, but there's no money in it. And there was some debate on the floor of the House late in the session that, oh, well, private companies can contribute to this trust fund. And I was sort of, a little baffled, a little confused. And then actually quite surprised when they decided this year, no, we are going to seed this thing. We're going to put 300, was it 300 million or 200 million?
Up to 300 million. It'll probably be 200 million immediately. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty remarkable.
So it does sound remarkable, and it sounds like a big investment. And again, before we get to the weird, where does this money come from thing, why now? Why this year? I mean, we just have a story in the Connecticut Mirror today that says Connecticut already does pretty well in kids' well-being, ranked 8th in the country. Obviously, that does not go across all kids in Connecticut for sure. Why, Erica, was now the time that this was supposed to happen?
It's been a process that's led up to this, and we go back 5 years when the pandemic hit, and working parents realized, I can't actually be a childcare provider and work at the same time. This is, it really became very clear to people how necessary childcare was, and that also was a moment when because people were talking about it, people realized that the industry was suffering from this, what Mark called the trilemma. Other people have referred to as it's a broken market. It's a market that doesn't work because of these competing kind of economic aspects of it, and there was this federal funding that had come in, this emergency funding that Connecticut did a really good job of deploying to childcare providers and making sure that what was there, even though it was already kind of weakening the childcare system in Connecticut, was sustained and maintained during the pandemic to the extent that was possible. So we took the federal dollars, we pushed them out really quickly. We did a good job of that. But as that was happening, and with the knowledge that those federal dollars were going to go away, the governor convened a blue ribbon panel. He got a bunch of people. I mean, it was, across the board, businesses, parent groups, community leaders, childcare providers that got together for a full year and came up with a 5-year strategic plan for childcare in Connecticut that they published January of 2024. And they said, look, it's going to cost $2 billion to shore up this sector and provide the support that working parents in Connecticut need. And it's just been ongoing. So that was when they created the trust fund during last year's legislative session. And this year they said, we're going to seed it.
So this is the part where
$2
I
billion
asked,
item, they actually laughed at them at a public hearing as Eva
It's a lot of money. Yeah.
well, it is a lot of money, and this is this is the part where I asked the political reporter. So this seems like the sort of thing that a governor that, I don't know, is running for office again does. It makes a real priority, and seems like Governor Lamont wanted this to happen.
This is a huge political asset for him on several levels. One, was produced, and Erica touched on it. A lot of people roll their eyes when they hear about a blue ribbon task force. This group actually turned into a group that did negotiations. And Eva Bermuda Zimmerman, who chaired it, it wasn't a bill signing because the bill actually hasn't technically reached the governor's desk, even though it's passed. But they had a celebratory event the other day. And, when it was her turn to speak, she called up two people who she considered to be key players in those talks. One was Chris DiPentima of the Connecticut Business and Industry Association. And if you know Eva's politics, for her to call up Chris DiPentima and welcome him, I almost fell off my chair. And then the other person was Maria Reyes of the SEIU union, who is organizing childcare workers. So, I mean, you had labor, you had business, and, CBIA has, under Chris DiPentima, has been, I think, pragmatic. They have been a voice for more housing as well as more daycare, more affordable childcare. So it works for him that way. It works for the governor in another way. There are people on the left who are quite annoyed that he would not sign on for a new child tax credit, as opposed to beefing up the existing earned income tax credit for folks who have kids, which was as a compromise. So, I mean, this is something that is, if he indeed delivers on what he indicated he was going to do, which is running for a third term. He is not formally announced, but he certainly was leaning that way in the press conference he had the day after the session ended last week. This is something that you can endlessly talk about. People are excited about it. It will touch a lot of people. It helps a workforce that is largely female and women of color. It's a way to get excitement in a part of the electorate that is very important to Democrats.
But before we move off this piece of legislation, though, we should just touch on this. And far be it for us to go too far down the Keith Venufian road here and talk about budget specifics. But it does kind of matter that this was like off budget, and the way that this got done is something that actually rankled some people at the Capitol. Can you just explain to people who don't exactly understand how this got done, and why it matters to the stability of the vaunted fiscal guardrails?
It was a compromise on the part of the governor. I think the governor made a political decision that you could not retain them without change, that it was unpalatable at best to keep telling people we cannot meet what everybody agrees. Really, there's a consensus on many of these unmet needs. And to continually say we can't do it, even though this year it's going to be, I think, a $2.4 billion budget in the year that's ending. We've been producing sizable surpluses year after year after year. And because of the volatility cap in particular, it was deemed to have been income that you cannot fully rely on, and much of it would have to go to the budget reserves, which are now full under statutory limits. And then after that, they go to pay down Connecticut's unfunded pension liability, which not so long ago was the absolute worst in the United States because Connecticut was paying pensions as you go instead of doing what everybody else was doing, which is investing money in Wall Street and watching the miracle of compound interest work and help you meet your pension obligations. So this was a huge hole Connecticut was in. So that was the reluctance to touch it. But as House Speaker Matt Ritter, for example, would argue to the governor, if you don't make some changes, if you don't compromise, the whole system's going to get blown up, in 3 years or so, because people are going to be furious. And this budget did a lot for a lot of groups, but it did not do as much as people argued needed to be done. One example is Medicaid reimbursement rates. They did make some improvements. There are going to be some further improvements in the second year, but they are still very minimal in a state that has not really touched Medicaid reimbursements since 2007. And it's not just, people say, well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is if you're raising a kid on Husky, which is Medicaid for children in Connecticut, and by the way, that's 40% of all the kids born in Connecticut are born to families on Medicaid, which is pretty consistent with the national number. America is in fits and starts, approaching something not quite universal health care, but obviously the government healthcare is a huge, huge thing. And if you don't touch the reimbursements, you have trouble finding a pediatrician, for example, who will take Medicaid, and then your healthcare coverage is worthless.
Actually, just to add to that, it ends up not only affecting people who have Medicaid insurance, but also because providers because the reimbursement rates are so low, there are some providers that can't even serve their other patients because they're just not being able to make the money, make the numbers work. So it's there's a lot of reasons why those reimbursement rates were
And the other aspect of that is you leave money on the table. What I mean by that is Medicaid is a 50-50 program between state and federal government. So when the state spends more money, they get more federal money back. So, I mean, that's another argument to be doing it. But in any event, it explains the pressures that were on the governor to really move on this. The governor has certainly established himself, at least in the eyes of the Democratic Party, as a fiscal centrist, and a fair number of Republicans would also categorize him that way. Perhaps not in an election year where he will be painted as a born-again tax and spend liberal, which will be interesting to see that unfold.
Well, there's a lot here to cover, but maybe we should just turn to a big piece of unfinished business because I think it could eat up a lot of our conversation here. Eric, the big housing bill that Governor Lamont didn't really take much part in. It seems quite likely that that's something that is still in negotiation. Maybe you can explain where we are with this piece of legislation and what exactly it would do, because this is something that has been talked about in various ways at the Capitol for quite some time.
Yeah, every session since I've covered the legislature, housing legislation has met with sort of spectacular end. I don't know if that's overstating it, but it's a topic that well, as Mark mentioned a minute ago, the Connecticut Business and Industry Association is, they've said over and over again that employers can't hire people because people can't find a place to live because there's not enough housing. The estimates are 100,000 units short in the state of Connecticut. That's a huge number of people that can't find a place to live and can't be contributing to the economy. So there's a lot of reasons why housing has been a priority for a lot of lawmakers, and then there's a lot of reasons why those reforms have gone nowhere. People, don't want the everything that comes with additional density in their towns. Connecticut is a lovely, sprawling, leafy, state, and density presents a lot of potential changes for a lot of small communities. So there's obvious kind of issues with getting that legislation done, and it was pretty surprising, pretty remarkable this year that the housing bill did go through. It passed both chambers. It's waiting for Lamont's signature. Lamont is now saying he might want to see a few changes with it. There's a possibility that he'd call the legislature back to discuss and make some tweaks. Not something people are too thrilled about. But one of the components, and Mark, feel free to jump in at any point, but there's an element called Towns Take the Lead, which was where every 5 years towns have to be evaluated for the number of affordable units they need to add, plan and zone for, and there's some question of whether that's a mandate or whether it's a suggestion, and I think that's where some of the frustration has come in, and some of the opposition has been on that piece of it. And Mark, what else was in there that I'm missing?
That's the big one. The other things, there was a provision that would require communities I'll use a double negative, not to require parking. It was projects
Right,
of a certain
parking.
size. And depending where the project is, that is, should not necessarily be a problem. But one of the objections that it was kind of a one size fits all, and what might be fine in one community might not work in another. If you're talking about citing, a 9-unit apartment building on a narrow street where there's no reliable on-street parking, that was a big one. The governor is doing something I've never really seen before, which is he has the leverage of a threatened veto, but now he's saying he would be satisfied if the legislative leaders agree on making certain revisions, including to what Erica described, that setting those numerical goals the governor viewed as overly provocative, and he would like to see them tweaked. Exactly how, he has not said, but what he has told legislative leaders is if we can reach a deal on changes, he'll sign the bill now on the promise that sometime when they return in special session to address, federal budgetary issues, that they make those changes then. I've seen them do that in the same session, where you use one bill to change another because the first bill took 12 hours to pass and they don't want to go through that again.
But I also read, at least, and you may have more information on this, Mark, that at least one of the Democratic leaders, Martin Looney, has said, look, I mean, if we get back and we get together and we revise it, we might make it even tougher than it is right now. I mean, the sense is that some of the Democrats who finally got this across the finish line after years and years of talking about this probably don't want to back down so quickly, because what I think I've been hearing for years from people as I cover housing in the state is, we've always had suggestions of what towns can do, and towns by and large don't do it if they don't have to. And if the state's going to be a little bit tougher about it in order to get housing built in certain places, well, then damn well those Democratic lawmakers are going to stick with that.
So the other piece of this is there is great suspicion. So the stick involved here, there's some carrots, some incentives, but the stick involved here is something called 830G. It's a housing law that if you don't have a certain percentage of affordable housing, it's easier for developers to override local control. That's a very simplistic summary of it. And that makes some certain suburbs crazy about that. And there is language in this bill to sort of tweak that delicate balance about how much pressure can you put on a town, but not take away a legitimate ability to review for reasons of safety and traffic and whatnot. And that's been the delicate balance. There is a lot of misrepresentation about what this bill does. I can tell you that is, infuriated the governor. He thinks that is really overwrought. But be that as it may, this is politically sensitive to this governor. This governor won re-election in a landslide, largely because he flipped 45 suburbs that had gone Republican 4 years earlier. So the governor is sensitive to that, and there are any number of legislators in both parties, but including the Democratic Party, because part of the Democrats' success in the General Assembly since Trump's first election has been flipping high-income suburbs in Fairfield County and elsewhere. I mean, Lamont, for example, won, I think, every shoreline town except for East Haven, all the way from Greenwich to Stonington. So people are sensitive to that. And this bill passed by relatively close margins. There are 102 Democrats in the House, and I think it was 84 who voted for it. So, there are significant misgivings. And even some of the Democrats who voted for the bill probably privately would not mind some revisions that are going to take some of the heat off of them when they seek reelection next year.
It's interesting, though, is obviously we were talking about this before when we were talking about a bill that would put more money in the pockets of people who do early childhood education, understanding that people need to be able to pay for places to live, to actually work in these towns. The fact that this finally got across the finish line, Erica, though, for the third time at least, proposed legislation that would expand some renters' rights did not move forward. And that's something, again, that a whole lot of people in the state who are looking at protections for people from eviction, they're saying this is something that the state needs to get out ahead of, and the state is not getting out ahead on that issue.
Yeah, I think the dynamics there are that again, I mentioned the 100,000 or so shortage of units. You have some protections for folks who are over 62 or folks with disabilities can't be evicted from a unit unless they meet certain legal reasons, like they haven't been paying their rent, for example, or they've caused destruction to the property. But anyone else outside of those categories, you don't necessarily need to meet one of these reasons. And advocates are finding that a lot of the people who are getting evicted from their homes are largely lower income, people of color, and are becoming unhoused or homeless then. So it's, there's this other aspect of the shortage of housing, which is that it is literally leading to a rise in homelessness, and you've seen a very significant rise in the number of people who are unhoused. So so that piece of it, right? They did not pass these protections for folks who may be getting evicted, and the theory is that could continue to drive up the homelessness issue.
Can I talk about another piece of legislation that passed, Mark, that is likely to go to veto? This is a bill that would have given jobless benefits to strikers. We've talked about some issues that have some bipartisan support. This is not one of those. This is not one of those issues, and it seems likely that that's something that Governor Lamont will veto.
Yes, the governor hates to say he's going to veto something because it just seems to go against his nature to be mean. But I have succeeded in getting him to state on the record that is indeed his intention. Um, the argument for giving jobless benefits to strikers is something that, requires a graduate level seminar on labor law and the balance of power. And there is a legitimate case for doing that. But viscerally, it hits people as something that's wrong, that you're putting your thumb on the scale on behalf of unions, even though unions in this country right now um, are at a great disadvantage. I mean, the balance of power has clearly shifted.
They're kind of getting their butts kicked across America, is what you're trying to say, and it's
Yes,
true. Yeah.
the National Labor Relations Board is non-functional at this point. Even when unions win the right to represent, they're having trouble winning contracts. But having said that, this is something that is, um, by most measures, a radical step. This only exists in New York and New Jersey. Washington State has passed a law that will offer these benefits on a slightly lower basis starting next year. But New York and New Jersey offer what the bill was in Connecticut, which passed both chambers, and the governor's going to veto, which is after 2 weeks on the strike line, you would be eligible for unemployment comp. Again, the business community it hates it not just because of how it affects negotiations, but it could potentially put added pressure on the unemployment compensation trust fund, that's how jobless benefits are paid. That's not paid by tax dollars. These are employer contributions. It's basically an insurance system. So it's again, I mean, Marty Looney, the Senate President pro tem, who's a great, great scholar of the labor movement. He is the son of somebody who was involved in a very famous strike, Remington Firearms, and that really had shaped his view as to what it means to have the breadwinner go without pay for long periods.
Mm.
But anyway, it's just a bridge too far for this governor. This governor has been very supportive of many labor initiatives, including a minimum wage that's now pegged to the cost of living, which gives Connecticut one of the higher minimum wages in the country. He has signed laws that ban what are called captive audience bills, which were used to really intimidate unions in some cases. Paid family sick days is a nearly universal mandate that you have to offer some paid time off. And then there's the paid family and medical leave program that the governor has supported. So, the governor's been there on a lot of labor things, but he's not there on this one. And, he'll certainly be hearing about it when he appears before the AFL-CIO looking for an endorsement if indeed he runs again.
I, I'm wondering, Eric, if you could walk us through where we exactly are with the attempted expansion of the Trust Act in Connecticut. This, of course, is a law intended to protect immigrants in the state. And as we watch what's happening in Los Angeles and as issues around immigration and immigration enforcement kind of swirl across America, I guess I'm wondering where we are right now with the expansion of a law that's already in place and provides some protections already to people in Connecticut.
Yeah, let's see, the law that was already in place, basically what it does is, uh, if there is it's going to get technical. If ICE has, let's see, if for folks who are in Connecticut and ICE has a certain type of warrant to arrest them. Um,
Do you want
the
me to jump?
Connecticut local and state law enforcement in Connecticut can collaborate with ICE. If they don't have that type of warrant, local and state law enforcement cannot collaborate with ICE. And what, this is it's sort of a states' rights thing. It's whether, to what extent do we help out federal authorities in detaining someone that they're looking to detain? We had those rules in place, and what the expansion has done has well, there are several components, but one of which is if a person is detained in a way that's unlawful, where local or state law enforcement helped out in an instance where they maybe shouldn't have, that person now has the right to sue, I believe, the jurisdiction that detained them. So, Mark, what else was in there?
Yeah, I mean, the argument was the Trust Act was unenforceable to the extent that if a local police department or court officials ignored the law, there was no recourse. So one of the major things in this expansion is yes, as she said, it allows a person to go to court and get an injunction, not really to help themselves, because if they are now detained, that is probably more likely than not game over. But what it does do, it sets a standard, and the hammer is, if a town does this and they lose the court case, they are liable for legal expenses, and that's sort of the kick in the butt that they put in the law to try to give some more teeth to the Trust Act. But this is something that makes journalists crazy, because there's so much misrepresentation about what it means and what it doesn't mean. Very simply, there is, Donald Trump has made us all constitutional scholars, and we've gone back to our history books. But there's something called the
Not all of us, but please continue.
Well,
yes.
This is a real simple. There's something called the Anti-Commandeering Clause of the United States Constitution. And what that means is, the federal government cannot force a state or municipality to be an agent of the federal government. So when the state declines to help, they are not violating federal law unless it's done certain ways. But by and large, they cannot be forced to enforce federal immigration laws unless ICE, for example, has a judicial warrant, and then that must be honored. But there's no requirement for the cops to go help round up people whose only offense is that they are here, on an extended, they've overextended a visa, which is a very common thing. And oh, by the way, that's a civil violation. That is not a criminal violation. So when people say, well, every undocumented person here is a criminal, that is not true. They may be in violation of civil laws, and they are indeed subject to deportation, but it's a whole nother thing than lumping them all together as a criminal class.
But another thing that makes journalists crazy is just, at this point, does this become law in Connecticut? Does this expansion become law? Because it doesn't seem like it's something that the governor likes too much.
No, the governor was more engaged this time on a whole bunch of bills. The housing bill was an exception and in fairness to him, it was really, the version was voted on was done very, very late. But no, the governor did engage on the revisions to the Trust Act. There were some changes made, and he has indicated he intends to sign it.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Wasn't entirely clear given some of his previous statements about this.
As it was originally written, you are absolutely right. It did sound like he was really discouraging the legislature from going forward for a couple of reasons. One is the substance of it, but the other thing is he viewed it as more provocative to the president than it might be actually more helpful to migrants. That he did not want to provoke the Trump administration to saying, all right, we're going to spend a lot of time in Connecticut rounding up migrants.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a small state. Let's stay off the radar. We got some people asking. Kayla Clark has a question for us, and I'm wondering, Erica, if you can maybe walk us through environmental legislation that got passed this time around. There's a headline that I love from a couple days ago. It says, after years of frustrations, climate advocates give tepid praise to Connecticut lawmakers, which I think sort of sums it up, because I think the environmental advocates I know over the last couple of years have been waiting for Connecticut to pass anything. So what did they do this session?
It's something, which is more than they have done. And to be fair, actually, when those bills did pass, we were all at the Capitol there, and there was jubilance there. People. This was exciting that some stuff had finally come through. A couple of bills, one of which offers, I believe it offers several incentives and other programs to help Connecticut get to net zero emissions by 2050. Some of the debate on that was that people were concerned that these were going to become mandates as opposed to incentives. I think that's still kind of a conversation that wasn't totally resolved. The other one was and I'm reading from some notes here, focused on preparing for the impacts of climate change by updating the state's water plan and requiring towns to consider sea level rise when making zoning changes, and some mandates for flood risk disclosures in real estate transactions. So it's it was a wide range of things. Oh, and lest I forget, the pesticides and rodenticides components of that bill were actually among the more controversial. The pest control industry had some major issues with those components, but it did all go through in the end.
I was laughing when you were asking the question because, I should quiz Erica. What word am I thinking of? It's a single word that described this bill and a few other bills this year. Do you know what I'm thinking of?
What word?
Aspirational. It was
Oh,
aspirational.
yes, actually, yeah, you did hear
Yes.
that word. Yeah, exactly,
And
exactly.
and again, not to take away from it, because there are inducements to make certain investments. There are rebates involved, heat pumps, that kind of thing. But the 2050 goal is indeed aspirational, and the state has not been making a lot of progress under existing legislation. And of course, this comes against the backdrop of the federal government completely backing away from the notion of addressing climate change. We had a big debate in Connecticut not so long ago about whether we would use the California rules about electric vehicles or their more permissive but still ambitious federal rules. And it's there basically are not those federal rules anymore. So until President Trump leaves office, there's not going to be a lot, I think, that's going to happen. One of the arguments in Connecticut always is it's a small state. Because of where it's located, it's subject to downwind pollution, and that's one of the things that the Trump administration has attacked. The so-called good neighbor rules.
But the Supreme Court's also done a number on that too. It's gone beyond any administration efforts to get rid of that type of legislation. I mean, essentially, the Supreme Court has said that that's not something that can be taken into consideration in the way that it was certainly hoped for years ago.
Yeah, so there were two bills. It was a Senate bill that when Erica referenced the resilience issues and the planning for rising seas, that was in a Senate bill, and then the House had a version of something that was attempted last year. And there was a lot of anger in that the Senate never took it up. It got through the House, and again, it had more carrots than sticks. It was somewhat aspirational, and the Senate just didn't touch it.
What about energy issues, Erica? I mean, obviously, something that people have been talking about quite a bit is the high cost of energy in Connecticut. What did lawmakers do this time around to actually potentially save people money on their electric rates?
Right. That this was a major negotiation, went till late in the session. Both Democrats and Republicans during the session had proposed their own legislation for trying to bring down electric costs for consumers in Connecticut. We all know this is hugely, we pay more in Connecticut than any most other places. Part of that is because we're sort of at the end of the line on like the natural gas pipelines, and we have this nuclear power that we buy that maybe a little bit pricier than if we were to extend natural gas pipelines, so on. There's a lot of complicated dynamics in Connecticut, reasons why sort of we just have higher rates than anywhere else, and so lawmakers were really trying to hammer out how to get those costs down for people. What was it ultimately, Mark, that they were able to do to get the $100,
Yeah,
basically a roughly average of $100 less on your annual electric
it all
rates?
goes to the public benefits charge, which is um, there are things that, money that we pay as part of our electric rates that go into funds for conservation, which saves energy, that helps pay for the electric bills of people who cannot afford it. But the big one in there is this special deal for Millstone. It was a deal struck years ago when natural gas was very cheap. And the way that I'm guessing most people on this call understand that Connecticut largely deregulated the generation of electricity. What Eversource, what our utilities regulators regulate is really the delivery of that power. So it's a limited portion of your bill. But there were nuclear plants around the country who were either closing or threatening to close because in the competitive market, the cheap natural gas used to generate electricity was driving down the cost of electricity. So what Connecticut did with Millstone is there's a side deal. It's complicated, but essentially it's a fixed price, which when natural gas is expensive, which happened during the early months of the war in Ukraine, it's actually benefits ratepayers in Connecticut. We get a break, but at other times we're paying a little bit extra to that power at Millstone that is so important for two reasons. It's a significant part of the base load that's always there. And it's also by far the single biggest generator of carbon-free power in Connecticut.
We have a couple questions here coming from people, and I don't know if you guys can answer this one. Let's see. Gus asks, what happened to the absentee voting for all bill? Nearly 60% of voters, Gus writes, voted yes to expand absentee voting access on the ballot last November, but the legislature didn't do it this session. What did anything happen?
Connecticut basically has no fault absentee ballot. I mean, to a great degree. I'm trying to remember. I'm completely blanking if that's on the ballot for the next time. I'm embarrassed to say, yeah, that was not on the radar at all this session. Early voting is certainly taken away, kind of the push for that. Connecticut did make an intermediate change, which liberalized the law to the extent it is consistent with the state constitution, which basically allows almost anybody to vote by absentee. It really broadened the conditions. But I am completely blanking on whether or not we still have to do.
And obviously, yeah, Eric. I don't know. I'm trying to think of where we are right now because so much changed since COVID, and then the ability to actually do early voting. We'll have to go back and
There was a time I would be so embarrassed at not knowing this, but I'm well past that.
There's a go ahead, Eric. There's a lot of stuff that we just can't know. Well, here's something that
I should know that. I should know that.
You should know that.
Thank you for embarrassing me.
Here's something that you do know. No, I mean, if we can't embarrass you at least once, there's no sense in even doing these things anymore. There is one thing that I think you would know something about, and I actually had pinged you a little bit ago, Paz, about this. This is the sort of story that would have been the lead story during a political roundtable program that I used to host. But there was a move to sort of take away some of the independence of the State Elections Enforcement Commission. And that's something that Governor Lamont kind of stepped into. Where exactly does that stand right now? What was it? What was the attempt by lawmakers, and what exactly ended up happening?
The leaders of the four caucuses, right? So you're talking Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate agreed they were going to make some changes to elections law. Some make it a little bit easier to raise matching funds to qualify for the public financing program. But one of the ones that kind of made good government types a little crazy is the executive director and general counsel. That's the top position at Elections Enforcement Commission. This is, by the way, this is something that was created in the immediate aftermath of Watergate. This is a response to one of the largest political scandals in the history of the United States. So it's been this way for 50 years, that there's a commission that would have the ability to hire and fire the executive director. What the legislature did was say, no, we're going to make that person's hiring subject to several layers of legislative review. You're going to have to clear a committee. You're going to have to clear the House. You're going to have to clear the Senate. And so that was going to really erase, both substantively and optically, the optics were awful, of bringing that under the direct control of the General Assembly in a way that the Freedom of Information Commission is not required to do. But this is the thing that most directly affects lawmakers. The governor said, I'm going to veto that bill unless you take out that provision. So they took out that provision and a separate law, and the governor will sign it. But this was an incident of the governor really stopping something. By the way, in fairness to the lawmakers, the Elections Enforcement Commission has had its issues. They were very slow in approving public financing grants in 2024. Republicans thought this was partisan, it was directed at them, and there's no evidence whatsoever of that. I mean, this was a problem across the board. So there's certainly room for improvement at the Elections Enforcement Commission, but there's new leadership there. And it really did come across as something that was punitive. And yes, on the old wheelhouse, we would have killed a half hour anyway on this one.
Probably would have talked about that for just a little bit of time. We're running a little bit low on time. We have just maybe a couple other questions I can get to, but before we run out of time, I'm wondering, Erica, if there's anything else that you saw during this session that just sort of caught your eye. Not maybe wasn't the biggest story, but was something that you and your colleagues, as you were kicking around the newsroom, were saying, wow, that's really interesting, or I can't believe that they did that, or some shenanigans that happened at the end. I'd love to know what really stuck with you at the end of this.
Well, it's an interesting thing toward the end of session. Suddenly, the Legislative Office Building and Capitol were overrun with children and families. And these were the families that do homeschooling, that homeschool their children. And they were there day in and day out for a period of days. And it was all in an effort to ask the legislator to not regulate homeschooling. And that they ended up being successful. There weren't any homeschool laws that came through this session, but they certainly showed up and advocated for no regulation. Now, it came in the wake of the Office of the Child Advocate had released a report about, which was in response to the case in Waterbury where the man was found having been kind of kept in his house for many years. ostensibly that family was homeschooling him from a young age, but the system had sort of lost track of him. And the concern from the Office of the Child Advocate was that there are no laws or no regulations around homeschooling that can prevent something like that from happening. And since that conversation had happened, the report had been presented, homeschool families became very concerned that suddenly there was going to be regulation. But I believe, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, there weren't really any bills that had
No,
been raised addressing it anyway. So
no,
so it was a bit of a maybe talking past each other, that there was actually a ton of advocacy for something that wasn't even on anyone's plate.
Erica, we got a preview of next session, and it was a gift to us. And the House Speaker, no, to your point, there was no bill. So they were up there arguing against something that was really not a thing, but maybe a thing in response to
Right,
that.
exactly.
And in
But
fact, the Speaker of the House indicated that it will be taken up next year and it will be subject to public hearing, and there will be, but Connecticut right now has really very few standards, very little oversight. It's one of the most permissive states in the country for homeschooling. Homeschooling, became more of a thing after Connecticut ended the religious exemption for vaccines, which some parents use not for religious reasons, but if they had an objection to vaccines, that was what they used. And that's gone by the board. So there's a sense that homeschooling has kind of increased since then. But again, it's not only the Childhood Advocate report, but the Dalio Foundation put out an interesting piece of research about disaffected youth. And one of the findings is that Connecticut does not do a great job of tracking kids when they cease to show up in one school system. They may enroll somewhere else, maybe they don't. And that was something that also fits into this about, can we have some kind of better system of making sure the kids, if it's homeschooling or if they've moved to another jurisdiction, can we just ensure that these kids are getting an education?
yeah, interesting. If nothing else, it makes for a hell of a civics field trip for some of these kids to go spend some time at the Capitol,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. No,
Yeah, is it?
there's a great mix. I mean, of
Yeah,
ages and absolutely. And these kids have been up there for the vaccine issue and stuff. And yeah, I think that does become part of their
yeah.
education.
Paz, with just the last couple of minutes, with Nick asks, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking. Nick says, "Does Lamont have a clear platform and driving reason to run for a third reelection? If so, what is it?"
You want that in a couple of minutes. A legitimate criticism against the governor is what drives him. Does he have a fully fledged agenda? And I would say that's a fair question and a fair criticism of this governor, other than the fact he is a true believer in continuing fiscal discipline, perhaps with some now exceptions. Um, but yeah, that will be part and parcel of a Ned Lamont reelection. Now, if he is not challenged for the Democratic nomination, perhaps that might not come up as much as it would in a general election. But some of this is it's personal. It's he is married to a very bright and successful woman who's a venture capitalist, and she has no plans of retiring. And I think the snarky way of looking at it is, just because you need something to do is not a reason to run for a third term. But they have. If you look at his record over the last 6 years, he does have a record to run on. It is not. It is not the cutting edge record that elements of the political left in Connecticut would like to see. And that would be part of a campaign if anybody had the wherewithal to run a primary. And by the way, Marty Looney insists that there really is no true political left in the Connecticut Democratic Party, that he views it as a moderate to centrist party. And it's only by comparison with the right-wing Republican Party does it appear that it has a left to it. So
Interesting. Okay, well, I suppose that we'll leave it there. And thank you for your questions, folks. Thank you for attending. I want to thank Mark Pasniokis and Erica Phillips for spending this time with us. Thank you to you both, and happy end of session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, I'd like to thank a few folks who helped to make this possible. First of all, on the Connecticut Mirror side, publisher and CEO Bruce Putterman, executive editor Elizabeth Hamilton. Also, thanks to Claire Dignan and Irene Mackey, Chris Nilsson, Gabby De Benedictus, Celia Klotzer, and Robert DeJoya. Thank you all so much. Also, like to thank the generous financial supporters of our event series, our presenting sponsor, Eversource, amplifying sponsor, CBIA, and the Mohegan Tribe. Publishing sponsors CLA, Express Strategies, Hinckley Allen, Rowthorne Law LLC, and the Causeway Agency. Next Wednesday, very fun event. I'll be joining Rosa DeLauro live as part of our In the Room series, sitting down with the Congresswoman at New Haven's City Seed. What's going to be fun about that is I think they're staging a play there during this time, and we're going to be sitting on a stage in front of a set that's set up for a play about New Haven pizza, which is just going to be great. So I got a chance to ask some very quality pizza related questions to Rosa DeLauro, and hopefully some more interesting and important things as well. That's Wednesday, June 18th from 6 to 7 p.m. It's part of the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. You can visit ctmirror.org/events for details. You can also find the videos of some of our past events up there as well. While you're on that site, ctmirror.org, don't forget to click on that big red donate button, because nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism needs your help more now than ever before. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with us. I'm John Dankosky. Drive home safe, but you're probably already home. Have a good night.